Cool. Hey everybody. Awesome first couple I caught David and Maureen's presentations. Great to see those. Today I'm going to be talking about something a little bit different than I normally talk about. Normally, and I'll get to an introduction here in a minute. I like to focus on marketing, digital marketing specifically. But Rob had this idea to do something a little more constrained and allow us to be a little more free. So I wanted to focus on something that I care deeply about, and a big reason why I'm in the industry is the history of legalization and criminalization of cannabis in the U.S. and what we can expect going forward, and hopefully give you guys a little bit of a different perspective of than what you normally hear from like the press releases and all of the PR that's in our industry. So my name is Jeremy. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Quality Roots, which is a retail company based out of Detroit, Michigan. We have 10 stores currently. We're working on opening our 11th in the Metro Detroit area. And my background is pretty varied between the cannabis space, retail, and technology. I have 10 years as a caregiver and grower in Michigan when we had our medical program here. And then I've participated in both the California and Oregon markets in the early recreational days in the early 2010s. I've done permitting and licensing for over a dozen dispensaries in different states. And before all of this, or before my current role, I was the director of e-commerce and then the director of marketing for two large dispensary chains in Michigan. And then ran marketing and partnerships for a cannabis software company that ended up being acquired by Alpine IQ or AIQ as it goes by now. In all of that, I've spent 15 years as a digital marketer and project manager in the tech space. I was building websites when, pretty early on as a fun thing for myself as a kid, and then transitioned in the when I graduated in 2007 from high school to building websites for people, and when I graduated from college, started building mobile apps for people. So that's a little bit of my background, and the last thing I'll say about that is, another reason why I care so deeply about this topic and cannabis in general is because I am a child of the war on drugs. Both of my parents had addiction issues and were incarcerated throughout my childhood, and this affected me quite a bit growing up. And I think it's important that we take a look at these things and understand how it impacts society in the past, present, and future. Um, so I'm going to start by going over a brief history of criminalization in the United States, kind of a quick view of that. I'm not going to cover everything, which is why I have further reading down here. If you are, I hope most of you have read Jack Herer's book, The Emperor Wears No Clothes. I know David mentioned Jack a few times in his presentation. One of my favorites, it gives a really good look at the United States history and the criminalization there. But another one of my favorites on this list is Cannabis Global Histories by Lucas Reichert, I think is how you pronounce his name. That zooms out a lot and gives you a global view of legalization. And when I first got introduced to that book, it really changed my perspective of how I think about the current cycle of legalization that we're in today. It talks a lot about India, a lot about Asia, a lot about Europe, and how they've gone through multiple cycles. And it kind of allowed me to take a step back and realize that this period of mostly recreational legal cannabis that we have today is just another cycle, and it might not be legal in the future as we move forward. So talk a little bit about the why. I covered that briefly. But why give this presentation? Why even talk about this? I want people to think critically about the current state of events, zoom out from just being like, wow, we have 39, I think it is now, 49 legal states in some manner, from medical to recreational, and the majority of people in the United States live in a place where cannabis is legal to some degree. That's all great in the moment. And we hear these press releases and we hear these quarterly updates from the public companies about catalyzation moments and how if Florida turns on, all of the profit that they can give. But I think there's another side to that, and I think the reality is we nothing's promised. Legalization has made progress before, only to be shut down by corporate interest in our government, and it could happen again. All right, so quick context setting here for everyone. I'm starting in 1925. There's obviously history before that, but one of the bigger moments is when the League of Nations met in 1925 and included cannabis in their Geneva Opium Convention. This was really led by the United States, and pushed for, cannabis was being imported from elsewhere, and the United States didn't like it, and they were like, "Hey, everybody, you should make it illegal too." At the time, it was more accepted in other countries, but this is when that was included and kind of kicked off the modern criminalization in the last 100 or so years. Next time point here is in 1930, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics being established by President Herbert Hoover. They pressured and policed state governments to regulate the production and sale of cannabis. And all states had adopted some form of regulation within, I think it was about 5 years, so about by 1937. I can see some parallels of what's happening now, in our current administration. They don't seem to be targeting cannabis yet, but there's pressure from the federal government for state governments to regulate and comply with certain things. I think, we have to look at history to understand what might happen in the future, and this is a great example here. 2 years later, federal action is taken and Congress passes the Marijuana Tax Act in 1937, with the assistance from lobbying groups, people like William Randolph Hearst, who was lobbying on behalf of his newspaper company, because he didn't want hemp taking, he had interest in timber companies and he didn't want hemp taking his dollars. Companies like DuPont, who had a vested interest in things like nylon and plastics and were afraid of hemp. This is another one that Jack Hare's book dives very deeply into and is a great read on. And this is also the time where we start to see a lot of the mainstream propaganda come out against cannabis, promoting dangerous claims, racist claims, promoting it as a drug that minority groups primarily are drawn to, that lazy people are drawn to. This is where like a lot of the cannabis propaganda comes from that people are used to seeing, unfortunately. Um, fast forward a little bit, and in 1968, that the United States Supreme Court strikes down the Tax Act in Leary versus the United States. But it does not take long. And 2 years later, Congress enacts the Controlled Substance Act, which is what we all know about today, that kind of controls cannabis policy from a high level perspective. They declared it a Schedule One drug to be the most dangerous drug category with no medical value. And then this is where things, at least in my opinion, get pretty interesting. 1984 rolls along. You have President Ronald Reagan reenacting mandatory minimum sentencing. This was actually something that happened originally back in the 30s for drug laws, but was struck down later in the courts and didn't come back until 1984. This is also what most people would consider the beginning of the war on drugs, and also widens the racial disparity of enforcement in our country. Not only do you have cannabis enforcement disparities, but you have other drugs, the crack cocaine epidemic. A lot of bad things come from this crackdown on drugs in our society rather than a focus on, say rehabilitation or other means of progression, not just enforcement. So by 1994, the Clinton administration imposes a three strikes rule, which mandates life imprisonment for serious violent felonies if you have two other convictions, even if it's a cannabis conviction. So, you could have had two cannabis convictions on your record and got an aggravated assault charge for something that, maybe it was a terrible situation, but maybe you shouldn't be in prison for life for. We also had stricter rules and regulations around drug sentencing in general. that leads to an increase in a loss of rights, government benefits, job opportunities, and more. People with simple cannabis possession charges on their record no longer can get jobs. They're put into the system and churned out essentially. All of these things kind of lead to a pretty severe pushback, right? In 1996, we see what I'm going to say is, part of technically, I think most people consider like the early 2000s the second wave of legalization, but I'm going to include 1996 and Prop 215 in that because I think it was really the start of it. This is, in my opinion, the first mainstream wave of medical cannabis in the United States. That's not to say there weren't other successes. Oregon, Washington, Ann Arbor decriminalized cannabis before this. There were other success and other progress made earlier, but this is kind of the first one that like it comes to the masses, and things start to sway in the other direction. We start to say as a country, like, hey, this is messed up. We're putting people in jail for a plant, and maybe we should change this, and maybe there's some medical value here. So that brings us, quick pause. I'm going to bring us to the current state of things. This is what our cannabis legalization map looks like today. More green than not. From the outside looking in and first glance, pretty green scenario. You've got legal, you've only got, I think, 4 states left that are fully illegal. And most states have some form of legalization, even if it's only hemp. Wisconsin is the Wisconsin and Iowa are the lone islands over here, Indiana, Texas being a primary hemp state as well. But, looks pretty good. However, zooming back out, I want to continue to add context to this conversation so people understand the bigger picture, at least in my opinion here. So, going back to the 1990s, we just talked a little bit about what that looked like and the increase in enforcement and regulation there. This is really the 90s through the 2010s was really the height of the war on drugs, when things got out of hand the most, I would say. I mean, you could push for like the 80s, when things were maybe a little bit crazier and chaotic, but the level of imprisonment and enforcement really peaked in the 90s through the 2010s. Our cannabis arrests exceeded all other drug arrests combined. The U.S. prison population peaked in 2010 through 2012, and drug convictions were a huge part of that. The DEA and FBI do a bad job of discriminating between cannabis convictions and arrests and other drugs. So at times it can be hard to understand, how many people were arrested for marijuana versus something harder. So that makes it a little bit difficult to get these numbers in. But looking at the FBI's, all this comes from the Uniform Crime Report from the FBI, by the way, at the bottom there. But looking at those, you can see that in 2007 there were nearly 900,000 marijuana arrests nationwide, and most of those were for simple possession. They outnumbered arrests for all violent crimes combined. And the U.S. total prison population peaks around 2009 at 2.3 million, which also happened to be the highest per capita incarceration rate in the world, at least officially. There's probably some countries that don't report truthfully on that. But in the modern world, that's a pretty stunning statistic. And I believe I didn't find anything. Maybe I didn't look hard enough, but I believe we still hold the record, or at least top five maybe for highest per capita incarceration rate. We continue to incarcerate people at unprecedented levels in the United States. Um, Move on to the next slide here. So, few more pieces of context to bring things into the picture. Specifically, what I call the prison industrial complex. So again, going back through those different periods that we've already outlined here, you have on the left the action, if you will, that was occurring at the time, and then the result of it. So, in the early 1980s, as the war on drugs is kicking off, you have the emergence of private prisons in America. The CCA, which is now Core Civic, is the first founded in 1983, and Geo Group, which are Core Civic and Geo Group are the two largest private prison entities, for-profit prisons in the United States. And they followed shortly after, and they still are today. Um, as things progress, three strikes happen, zero tolerance policies, private prison contracts continue to multiply. And by 1998, we have almost 100,000 people held in private facilities in the United States. And then in the late 2000s, we start to see that peak. We have over 120,000 people in federal and state prisons or in federal and state inmates in private facilities. This is like, people started seeing the profit behind these things. And I'll get to more of this in a minute, but a little anecdote. Like these are Core Civic and Geo Group are public for-profit companies. If you go and look at their quarterly reports, you will find quotes from their CEO, their CFO, saying that cannabis decriminalization, cannabis legalization will lead to a decrease in their profits and that it should be lobbied against. This is people who make their money putting other people in prison, saying that, hey, our business model doesn't work very well if you guys take away the criminalization of cannabis. So late 2010s, Obama in 2016 reverses some of the action on private prisons. Maybe this isn't a good idea. Trump's first administration that is take that all the way to today. While legalization has continued to grow overall, I would say that it's kind of plateaued. We're at, I think, again, 39 states that are legal in some manner, but less and less are coming online, and the holdouts seem less and less likely any progress. We're even at the point where you have certain states like Massachusetts looking to roll back cannabis legalization. And I'll talk more about that in a minute here. Private yeah, prison facilities are beginning to reopen. We just had one reopen as a ICE detention center here in Michigan. And all across the country, Core Civic and Geo Group are looking to reactivate the facilities that large amount of funding is being put back into this by our government. And overall, some people might debate me on this, but I would say that rescheduling efforts or descheduling have pretty much stalled at this point. We all expected to see something in 2024. 2025 was this point, again, in my personal opinion, because there are so many corporate interests and I want to see it happen overall. To kind of dive in and prove my point here a little bit, and again, maybe help everybody think a little bit differently about these things, I picked out one particular state, one particular instance, and that's Florida. We had back in 2024, we saw another election cycle where Florida had a chance to go recreational, and it did not happen. You had companies like Trulieve who put over $15 million into lobbying efforts. You had everybody from Jungle Boys, Planet 13, Connected, Alien Labs, GTI buy into that market in anticipation of legalization. But also at the same time, Florida's private prison population increased by more than 200% since 2000. Core Civic and Geo Group money into GOP candidates and lobbying in states like Florida, very specifically Florida, to the since 1989, and to the tune of over $35 million. And it's not just these direct companies benefiting. For those unfamiliar, there's a whole complex. This is why I mentioned the prison industrial complex earlier. There's a whole complex of companies that benefit from imprisonment of people, whether it is private imprisonment or governmental. Companies like GTL and JPay who profit off of phone calls and communicate video calls and communication of prisoners to their family. Companies like AbbVie, who is a pharmaceutical company who has government all of our facilities. The list goes on. There are food companies that contract. There are security companies, and these people. So you can very quickly start to see what we're stacked up against. And when you think about it, the cannabis industry is about I think 35 billion per year right now. And then you look at who we're stacked up against and who's lobbying against us, and it ends up being peanuts. So to continue down this Florida example, Florida Senator Marco Rubio hiring a G economic private prisons are a economic development mechanism in their state. Um, Staff in 2015, previous Governor Rick Scott receiving donations from Geo Group. We've seen current Governor Ron DeSantis say he would never sign a legalization bill. Um, we have seen the Florida Supreme Court strike down a voter approved amendment for recreational in 2021. This is the same Supreme Court that has four far right leaning. I think we're up for retention and made it. I'm not quite sure. I'd have to double check on that. There's been a lot of movement, obviously, in 2025. And then, since that legalization failed in 2024, we've seen something kind of interesting. Trulieve has actually retained the lobbying firm Ballard Partners to push for SB 438, which is a ban on hemp products in Florida. This is the same lobbying firm that is the main lobbyist for Geo Group. Um, I don't want to make any conclusions here, but SB 438 does come with enforcement mechanisms that put people in jail, prison, or fine them for selling hemp. We're talking about people that have legitimate businesses today, retail in Florida, may face jail and prison time if this goes through. So it's tough. I'm not looking to call out any one company in particular, but I think I bring this point up to illustrate that oftentimes, in my opinion, we as an industry are fighting our own selves, and we're holding ourselves back from progress overall. Other notable events or other notable reversals in 2025, the state of Michigan, where I'm located, is looking to increase taxes by 24% and limit license counts. The state of Michigan has been one of the most free market geared recreational states since the legalization has really kicked off. And now we're looking to roll that back, increase taxes on it. No other product in the state of Michigan or even really the country is taxed at such a high rate. And then also limit licenses and decrease overall availability of the product. For those unfamiliar, Massachusetts has a voter initiative that is collecting signatures right now to fully recriminalize cannabis in that state. And Massachusetts is a recreational state. You've got full recreational dispensaries. You've got hundreds of businesses that contribute to that state's economy, and they want to take that all away. And then this week, we had 39 states ask the U.S. House and Senate to ban hemp-derived products. Um, you know, all of these bans would come with some level of enforcement. Do I think these things need to be regulated? Yes. A ban, something that puts people at risk for jail, prison, or fines, I don't think that's the way forward here. You have a few other states like Ohio, proposing tax increases as well as ban on products. For those unfamiliar, a lot of people in Ohio shop in Michigan because of cheaper product and better selection. And Ohio is introducing bills to actually criminalize purchasing in other states. That would again come with potential jail time. Indiana and other states have begun banning advertisements, taking steps to make sure cannabis does not become legal in their states. And then overall, again, at least in my opinion, the Trump admin has stalled on rescheduling efforts and reinvested into private detention centers. So these are all signs that we may be, the pendulum, in my opinion, may be swinging back the other way. Now there is some hope. We just well, Michigan is over here saying we're going to increase taxes by 24% and limit licenses. We just saw California repeal their incremental taxes and give licensees a second chance. It's yet to be seen how that will play out, but I think it's a step in the right direction. We also see national retailers embracing hemp products, especially in the beverage space. You've got Target, you've got Circle K, you've got Total Wine. You've got regional groups carrying these things and making them mainstream. You even have cannabis MSOs launching their own hemp lines from GTI and Curaleaf to others. At this point, legal cannabis is a $35 billion market and contributing significantly at the federal level from an economy standpoint and the state level from an economic development standpoint, but also tax revenues. Our industry also supports over 440,000 jobs nationwide. And then the final point here that I wanted to make is I still believe that judicial action is probably our best path forward for change. I don't see personally legislative action or even admin action happening like some people do. Uh, Again, for those unfamiliar, the lawsuit that was introduced a couple years ago, Canna Provisions versus Garland, is still ongoing, and that was brought by the law firm Boies, Schiller, and Flexner. This is the same law firm that took the fight for gay marriage all the way to the Supreme Court and won. This lawsuit, if you haven't heard about it, I would encourage you to dig into it. They are arguing on several precedents and have some great arguments, but it takes a long time for these things to work their way up the courts. But I still think that judicial action is the best bet for change and the safeguarding of our industry in the long term. So, all that being said, what do we do? I don't know. I don't have the answer. But I will say, from my perspective, there's no unified effort among cannabis businesses to push for reform. I will acknowledge the fact that I think the hemp industry actually has more cohesion and lobbying power. And I hope that there's a way for both medical, recreational, and hemp to all come together and push for a better future. I think in the meantime, you can stay involved locally, you can write your reps, and you can vote. I hope one day that our industry can build a national presence and have a group that fights for us, and not just like from a corporate and profit oriented motive. I hope we can do it from a perspective of this is the right thing to do and it helps our society as a whole. Um, that's all I've got. I ended up at I think almost close to the full 30 minutes there. I got like 3 minutes left. If you
Hmm.
want to get in contact with me, the best way is on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on there. And if you have any questions or comments or want to do further research, I've made a million posts about about these things. If you Google it, you'll find it. And if we do have time for questions, happy to answer any or start a conversation with you guys.
Yeah, we definitely have some time, and take it if you want to take it away. There's a question in the chat already about one of the cases that you mentioned. And
Yeah.
then yeah, if anyone else has other questions or wants to dig into anything with Jeremy here, we've got
Well,
let's
which
see,
case was it the one at the end there?
yes.
Yeah, so the name of it, yeah, so that it's Canna Provisions versus Garland. And it's more than just Meg Sanders is the CEO of Canna Provisions. For anybody that doesn't know, Meg is a really amazing person in our industry. And it's more than just her fighting it. It's actually a group of people. Terrascend, I think, is involved in it as well. I know that Poseidon, which is one of the larger venture capital groups, and I think Original in the cannabis space also has some involvement in there. So there's a list of plaintiffs on that case, but if you want to look it up, yeah, Adam, thank you for throwing that in there. Also, Adam, thank you for the shout out on the campground. Maybe one day I'll do a different webinar on campgrounds and how positive outdoor recreation can be for our communities as well.
Any other questions or comments? Definitely surprising to see that peak in the 1990s, early 2000s. That
Yeah.
I didn't realize quite that we were rising to an ascent that basically was cut off by rec. I thought that it had already kind of started to wane, but it was just progressively getting worse during that time.
Yeah, I think that is like a misconception and something that like again personally I feel very connected to because like I was a kid and I grew up in the 90s and like I think a lot of people think of like the 1980s as like peak criminalization and effect on our society, but it goes it extends, I mean people I mean even today, there was a case I think 3 years ago where a single father who had his medical card in Michigan got put into prison because his kid came to school smelling like cannabis. This is somebody who's following the rules, who has his med card. Unfortunate situation that, maybe if he had a grow in his house, maybe the kid's clothes smelled. But this is a person who was doing things right and ended up suffering the consequences. And once, for those of you who don't know, once you have these things on your record, it follows you for life. It's hard to get a real job. It's hard to get a loan. You can't even vote to make change once this happens to you. So, I think it's important to keep in mind people today are still suffering the consequences, despite many of us making a living off the plant at this point.
Oh, definitely. And I think drawing that attention to just to the problem, right? I think too often society or organizations expect that if you call out a problem, you're also coming with a solution. But there's definitely an important role in just recognizing that problem, being able to, explain it well, right? And being able to walk people through it. And I definitely learned a lot from that presentation, man. And the further reading slide as well. I took a screenshot. We'll make sure to drop that in the notes so that folks can dig in and go on a little journey of their own there.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the platform, Rob. Not everybody lets me talk about these politically motivated things.
Hey, until the next Forbidden Sessions, man. No, thank you very much for participating and sharing your insight and experience here.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Hey, awesome, everyone. We've got running a little ahead of schedule still. Let's see if we've got everybody here